Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about religion after the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse and the ways in which it has represented some challenges to contemporary church-state relations. So I'm going to argue actually that in the process of implementing the recommendations by the state and religious groups, it's intensified this very unsettled relationship between state and religion, which existed previously. And in particular, it's pushed at the boundaries of the discourse of religious freedom versus secular institutional responsibility. And I'm speaking from a paper that was published earlier this year, and the citation is there. Okay, so, well, as you probably know, the Royal Commission was a landmark public inquiry into institutional child sexual abuse and responses to that. And the records are publicly archived at that address. The terms of reference were the widest of any Royal Commission. It was very carefully established. It drew on the strengths and weaknesses of other inquiries, in particular the inquiries that ran in Ireland and the Ryan report. It wanted to make sure that it didn't repeat the mistakes that other public inquiries have made. And the Royal Commission, which began in 2012, was actually the 81st public inquiry into institutional child sexual abuse in Australian history, so it wasn't new by any means. It was highly successful, and it was also the best resourced bipartisan government inquiry ever held. And it basically, we were, as a nation, invited into a conversation to listen to these accounts of sexual abuse against children, how they were facilitated by thousands of organisations. And we were also invited to listen to the stories of survivors, the impact of abuse on their lives, and the failure of organisations to respond. So it really challenged that idea that we hold children to be precious, because clearly institutions were struggling with that. So very early on, the Royal Commission identified that religious organisations had the worst track records of managing offenders and perpetrators and dealing with disclosures of abuse. So there were over 400 recommendations overall. 57 recommendations were for religious institutions, and they were in volume 16, which is 3 big books. And they covered legal, cultural, institutional and theological categories, so it was quite widespread. Of that group, you know, the most, of course, because the Catholic Church had the most significant amount of disclosures of abuse, most of the recommendations were directed towards them. And the book 2 is just on the Catholic Church, so I'm just going to be talking about that today. 60% of all complaints before the Royal Commission were from religious organisations, and of that 30% were from the Catholic Church. And it was just a catastrophic failure in religious organisations to respond to the criminal activity of mostly clerical perpetrators, but also across a range. So these following characteristics of religious institutions: poor organisational accountability and transparency. There was a tendency to protect offenders, especially when they were clerics. There was a reliance on internal laws and courts, such as canon law in the Catholic Church, to manage complaints. There was unjust treatment and stigmatisation of the victims, particularly when they came forward to make complaints. And there was obviously a patriarchal culture and theology. For example, the practice of clericalism was deemed to be central to all of the sort of systems of power that were in place. So many of the general recommendations for religious organisations are acting actually to counter the power, this kind of power of clerics and bureaucratic secrecy, by requiring that internal governance processes and policy reflect the 10 child safe standards proposed and sanctioned by the Royal Commission. And if you want to know what they are, have a look at the Royal Commission website. So the common features in religious groups about how they fail to protect children is really important to identify. And a lot of my work has been involved in that. But above all, I think the need to preserve the reputation of the institution above the care of children was paramount. And it wasn't just sort of like a few people making decisions here and there. It was a widespread institutional bureaucratised practice, and it was embedded in the bureaucratic mechanisms of organisational management. The final report says the denial or minimisation of child sexual abuse, failures to report alleged perpetrators to civil authorities, transferring alleged perpetrators between institutions or locations, acting to minimise public scandal and limit legal and financial liability, and failures to appreciate the impacts of child sexual abuse on victims. So I'm sure you've heard this before, but just it bears repeating because it's just so central to the failure of religious organisations to deal with this. So my argument is that the state is not an innocent partner here. The state actually facilitated a lot of this. And in my paper, I say it's fair to say that the reputation of religious organisations, particularly the Catholic Church, has been seriously affected by the revelation and extent of child abuse that took place in the very institutions that were mandated to care for those sectors of the population that were vulnerable and needed welfare. It's also fair to argue that one of the central problems characterising religious institutions and uncovered by the Royal Commission, a lack of organisational transparency, poor accountability, and the concentration of power in the hands of large clerical men was facilitated by the secular state, and in particular, its relationship with religious organisations. So what is that? So in modernity, religious groups have been positioned as special institutions. So they're enjoying certain legal, cultural and economic privileges, and they're legitimated by the state. And they're also protected constitutionally. And some of these privileges include tax-free exemptions for various kinds of financial income, where religions are recognised as charities, which is most religious groups, recognition that the laws and legal courts of religious organisations have jurisdiction over internal institutional matters, including the regulation of marriage and responses to allegations of child sexual abuse, and exemptions that are permitted that allow selected organisations to discriminate on the basis of employment and training. And that's led in particular to gender discrimination, particularly against LGBTQI cohorts and women. So the ongoing state approval of exemptions for religious groups to maintain their distinctiveness and what the state has accepted as tradition is protected in federal human rights law, and it's also very contested. Currently, you probably know, in Australia, the federal government has been working to increase these privileges by protecting religious speech, and there was a religious freedom review that was held, and there is currently legislation ready to go through Parliament, and this was in relation to election promises that were made by the Liberal government in 2019. So the state responded to the Royal Commission findings and recommendations in quite strongly. By early 2018, the Royal Commission finished in December 2017, released its report. Many of the 57 recommendations directed to religious groups, which were designed to protect children and identify religious practices that put children at risk, were being addressed. This put church and state at loggerheads with regard to firstly challenging the rights of religions to these special privileges in law, and secondly enacting state laws that directly encroached on religious laws and practices, and which have been responsible for keeping perpetrators safe. So here's some of the things that state did. So in terms of legal changes, there were longer sentences for perpetrators and new laws about grooming of children. There were practices designed to make civil and criminal court processes child-friendly, and they used trauma-informed court process there. There were institution of laws addressing failure to report crimes and to protect knowledge of offending. And there was an introduction of mandatory reporting laws for all religious leaders and teachers, and appropriate training and auditing of religious staff. So some of the sort of institutions that were set up, an interjurisdictional working party, the National Redress Scheme, the Framework for Protecting Australians' Children, and a National Office for Child Safety. And a national apology was made in October 2018. So it was a very strong response, and it's been quite uneven. For example, the National Redress Scheme has been a disaster, and it's been subject to 2 Senate inquiries to date. But in general, it's a very inadequate scheme. Which is being recognised across the board. But it did, in particular, the legal changes have been very effective. Okay, so how did the Catholic Church respond to these state sanctions? Well, first of all, the mandatory reporting has been very problematic for the Catholic Church because that would mean that that all members of the Catholic Church in positions of any kind of responsibility in relation to children were mandatory reporters, including priests hearing confessions. And in 2018, the Catholic Bishops' Conference, which is the main decision-making body of the leadership of the Catholic Church, decided not to abide by those state laws, and that any priest who was hearing a confession of child sexual abuse, either by a perpetrator, which has certainly happened in the confessional, or from children, from child victims, which has also happened, that they would not be reporting this to police because it would break the holy seal of the confessional, and that they were prepared to go to jail should that be the case. And then the other recommendation, important recommendation, was that the Catholic Church not investigate itself or audit itself in relation to child sexual abuse, and that any kind of professional standard should be formulated independently of church leadership. So that was ignored, and what they did was they set up an in-house professional standards system, CPSL, which was established in 2018, and they keep making an ongoing claim that this is independent of the church, and that's completely incorrect. Please go to the paper where I give details of just how incorrect this is. And there are some very worrying features here, including the requirement in the CPSL to abide by canon law obligations in relation to reporting, which still includes a requirement of secrecy. And they just announced very quietly a couple of months ago that in 2021 CPSL will be dismantled. So it's really unclear now how the church is going to investigate or audit itself. So the impact of the recommendations, my argument here is that if they were implemented as set out in volume 16, it would actually change the ways in which religious organisations work as faith traditions. They would look much more like secular institutions. They'd have embedded systems of transparency and accountability. They would be sort of regulated, they would have equitable leadership practices, and they would professionalise the priesthood, and that's just sort of the start of it. So in conclusion, the response of the Catholic Church to some of these recommendations is clearly positioning the church leadership in a very difficult situation. Clerical leaders are claiming that that these new laws and the recommendations impact on religious freedom, but this must be contested because the outcome could have disastrous effects on the safety and well-being of children. Well, it does have disastrous effects. That's already been evidenced. The state itself is in a very conflicted situation here. On the one hand, it's supporting human rights laws that protect religious freedom, and it wants to increase that level of protection, but it also has to enact laws that protect children in religious organisations. And it's clearly playing out between state and federal jurisdictions and between criminal and cultural spheres. And that is the end of the paper.
Thank you so much, Kath. That was really interesting. And I know you spent so many years working on this. Thank you. And next we have Josh Roose, who will be talking on religion and populism.
Yep, thank you. I just need to share the screen. All right. All right, can I just confirm you can see that?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right. First, thanks for the organisers for putting this together. It's a great panel, and obviously a lot of mentors and excellent people watching. Look, this paper starts from, or the background to it starts from research grounded in my time working at the Australian Catholic University. Whilst there, I had the opportunity to meet key leaders, travel, and to some extent gain an insider's look into the institutional power of the Catholic Church and its internal politics. And as a scholar of religion, it was obviously pretty fascinating. But it also stood at odds with key literature that I was reading about religion being hijacked by populists. And I thought this, the book that this is all based on, but also this paper, was an opportunity to refocus a critical lens from Islam, which I've looked at for quite a while, to Christianity. So to address that concept of religion being hijacked, I'm quoting here Mizuki and McDonald on the LSE religion blog. We are faced with an increasing exploitation of religion in political discourse by both mainstream politicians and right-wing populists to express belonging rather than believing, to defend the territory of Christendom rather than the values of Christianity. And it is argued here by me that while some groups do embrace an empty and rhetorical form of Christian identity, organised religion is an important ingredient of the contemporary global populist surge. Attempts to exonerate organised religion and religious leadership from responsibility for the demonisation of other faiths show a startling lack of understanding about how the theological framing of truth amongst fundamentalist or textualist elements of organised religion shape highly energised and often hostile responses to other faiths that have everything to do with religion. So these are some of the takeaways I hope you walk away with today. So I debated whether or not to focus the paper on just the framing of these concepts. I thought we'd all get bored with too much theory. But really all of religion, secularism and populism are contested terms. It's important to define very briefly, given that the time limits, how I am using them. For religion, I dropped historical and institutional perspective of religion as structuring principle on the one hand and as actor and claim maker in secularised settings on the other. As structuring principle, religion in its various faith and denominational manifestations has shaped our language, institutions, political frameworks and conception of morality more than any other organising frame. It remains embedded in our daily lives, even within secular societies. However, it is regulated to prevent religious actors from steering our political institutions or competing for primacy with the state. And this is precisely because religion grounded in faith that one possesses universal truth is an incontrovertible claim maker. I won't go into the difference between religion and theology and so on, but I do want to recognise faith as a propelling force and one within which intense personal and collective energy may be directed and indeed accumulated, very often with a focus on the common good. And faith plays a really powerful, important, positive role in life and society. But I'm particularly concerned here with the socio-political dimension of religion, and in particular, textualist claims to possession of the truth to the exclusion of other actors. Very briefly, I'll define populism as a tactic to attain political power, an empty shell devoid of belief. That is, saying whatever and doing whatever it takes to attain power. And just a brief quote that I like around secularism. However one defines from Calhoun et al. However one defines secularity and secularism, it involves religion. It is the absence of it, the control over it, the equal treatment of its various forms, or its replacement by the social values common to a secular way of life. All right, that's about the extent to which I'm going to go into the theory. So, textualism and theological claims to possession, or a unique claim to possession of truth, that is an understanding and unique relationship with God or a supreme deity, is an essential component of most, if not all, religions. Indeed, as Corbett has argued, the most significant and indeed proudest claim of any theological proposition is to be true. The relationship between populism and textualism has been powerful throughout history and indeed shaped the world that we live in today. Historically, challenges to truth claims by perceived imposters and all that they meant politically have been dealt with through violent means, whether via symbolic repudiation using powerful language and offensive language, or conquest. So St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, referring to Muslims, talked about Muhammad seducing the people by promises of carnal pleasure. His teaching also contained precepts in conformity with his promises, and he gave free rein to carnal pleasure. In all this, as is not unexpected, he was obeyed by carnal men. Ibn Taymiyyah, talking about Christians and Jews, referred to wrongdoers, disbelievers and transgressors that deserve the torment and punishment of Allah. And Martin Luther, without whom the Protestant Revolution and the world as we know it wouldn't exist, referred to, well, was equally condemning of Catholics, Muslims and Jews. But in particular, his language on Jews referred to real liars and bloodhounds who have not only continually perverted and falsified all of Scripture with their mendacious glosses from the beginning until the present day, and so on. He referred to bloodthirsty, vengeful, murderous, and murderous yearning. So the language here, and Luther in particular, has been described as a populist by many in the current era. Okay, so moving on to factions in the Catholic Church. Internal theological, and this is a picture of Pope Francis praying alongside the Mufti of Istanbul, Rami Yaran, at the Blue Mosque in 2014. Internal theological and political cleavages within religions and denominations often involve significant animosity, although those both on each side seek the same reward, legitimacy, and opportunity to lead the institution in the direction they wish it to go. This is particularly the case where authority is not devolved. This is demonstrated in the fight for control of the theological and political orientation of the Catholic Church. I explore this in brief by looking at the names chosen by the past two popes and their attitudes to Islam. Cardinal Ratzinger took the pontifical name of Benedict the Blessed after two individuals who had influenced his life's work. Pope Benedict XV, who was Pope from 1914 to 22 during the First World War, who fought to attain peace in Europe. And St. Benedict of Nursia, founder of the Benedictine order monasteries and highly influential in the spread of Christianity across Europe. Indeed, he's the patron saint of Europe. Both are inherently European in their work and focus. Europe for Ratzinger came into being through the marriage of faith and reason. Corkery notes, this encounter through which faith became oriented to philosophical reason, found its moorings in faith in God and in Christian moral values, provided a basis for living, a cultural spiritual foundation that served and must still serve as a criterion for judging whether something may be deemed authentically European or not. So Pope Benedict famously gave the Regensburg Address, in which he positioned Islam as irrational and violent. And seeing the relationship between religion and violence, Benedict quoted the emperor he was talking about, "Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new, and there you will find things only evil and inhuman. Such is his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached." There was obviously widespread condemnation across the Muslim world, but that was supported strongly by many European leaders. It was a very divisive speech. Pope Francis, upon his resignation, Pope Benedict was replaced by Jorge Maria Bergoglio, who became the first Jesuit Pope and adopted the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, known for his care of the poor. The election would prove to be a pivotal turn away from a hardline conservative theology toward one slightly more open to progressive theological positions. Pope Francis also expressed support for dialogue with the Muslim world and expressed support for migration, urging the need for Europe to rediscover its capacity to integrate. Among many sweeping reforms and realignments made to reflect this approach, Francis replaced Cardinal Muller, a committed anti-Islamic theologian and Vatican's doctrinal head, with a Spanish Jesuit, and removed arch-conservative US Cardinal Raymond Burke as a Vatican Supreme Court Justice. He also enacted several steps to open the church up to those previously excluded. This picture is of Michael Voris, founder of the Detroit-based Church Announcement website, The website states that the church militant is a Christian militia. They do battle against sin, the devil and demonic rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. This is a significant, there's a significant body of work looking at political Islam, a tautological concept that seeks to frame Islam in a manner that we in the secular West might understand. Political Islam may be understood as a broad category of analysis for the description of Islamic activism in the public sphere, and emerged a political force in response to secularism. In its most conventional sense, it refers to those who seek to break down the distinction between Islam and the secularised state. It relies on truth claims and certainty as to what constitutes authentic Islam. So thinking about that, and again applying that critical lens, which is almost exclusively by political scientists in particular, being sort of looked at in relation to Islam, I noticed that, and I thought about it, it's not particularly different to contemporary hardline textualist Catholicism. And the suffix of ist denotes steadfast possession of principles, in particular the possession of truth in their religion. So Islamist and Catholicist. So the Catholicists make a claim to incontrovertible possession of the one true faith. They seek a return to past greatness and have a powerful nostalgia for that perceived past greatness. Church and state must be inextricably intertwined. The secular state is illegitimate and immoral. There is a fundamental opposition to liberal human rights, including LGBTQI rights, but also more broadly the concept of a dialogue with other faiths. They seek the reinstatement of women in the home as wife and mother, and they have an inherently politicised interpretation of faith centred on the attainment of political power. So just in the back end of this presentation, I just want to look at two contrastive examples of the relationship between religion and populism in the Catholic Church. The push to oust Pope Francis by marginalised Catholics who deny his claim to possession of truth, and the close relationship between the Catholic Church and the hard-right populist Law and Justice Party in Poland. This picture here is a key opponent of Pope Francis, American Cardinal Raymond Burke, in his favoured red liturgical regalia. Given the significant theological and political shifts that have occurred since Pope Francis took the role, it is no surprise that he has made powerful enemies both within the Church and beyond. In 2017, for example, 62 critics of Pope Francis within the Church signed a filial correction concerning Pope Francis's exhortation on remarriage and communion. Many of Pope Francis' critics appear to come from the United States. Following the 2017 correction, critics led by Cardinal Burke and Steve Bannon, a former Trump advisor deeply embedded in far-right populist circles worldwide, and in particular Europe, accused Pope Francis of public actions that indicated a rejection of the truth of the faith and the canonical delict of heresy. In other words, the more liberal theological orientation of Francis stood in contrast to their hardline textualist approach, prompting the critics to commence political activism outside the institutions of Vatican power. And the first and most powerful weapon in their arsenal was to attack the Pope for denying divinely revealed truth. Cardinal Burke had extensive links with the Dignitas Humanae Institute, a right-wing aligned Catholic institute formed by British conservative Benjamin Harnwell, as a direct response to a growing secularist intolerance of Christians of all confessions that has led to a myriad of attacks on human dignity. And the institute had very close links with Steve Bannon. So I'm going to pull this together quickly, saying that whilst Cardinal Burke has since distanced himself from Bannon, their theological and political orientation have a really high degree of overlap. This is the Archbishop of Krakow with the President of Poland. The Catholic Church has worked closely with the ruling populist Law and Justice Party in Poland, whose name is biblically derived from Psalm 33:5. Speaking in the lead up to the European parliamentary elections, the chairman of the party, Jarosław Kaczynski, launched an attack on members of the LGBTIQ movement, painting them as an existential threat. And he stated, "We are dealing," this quote, "we are dealing with a direct attack on the family and children, the sexualisation of children, that entire LGBT movement, gender. This is imported, but today they actually threaten our identity, our nation, its continuation, and therefore the Polish state." In July 2019, the Law and Justice Party declared major policy LGBT free zones, suggesting that any public identification as lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender would result in violent consequences. Far from calling for toleration or criticising such measures as transgressions of human rights, the Archbishop of Krakow and a friend of Pope Marek Jedrzejewski and a friend of Pope John Paul II throughout his life compared activism for LGBT human rights to a virus, with the logical conclusion that it must be eradicated. In an interview with Australian television, he stated, "This time it's not a red plague, but a rainbow plague. An ideology that wants to subjugate us is a threat to our hearts and minds. It is a great threat, so we need to defend ourselves like against any other plague." He stated further, the ideal end goal was the repatriation of the Polish nation within the umbrella of the Catholic Church. From the very beginning, the history of the Polish state and Polish nation were connected with the history of Christianity. Hence this special role with these three elements, Christianity, nation and state, were so tightly connected that they were almost inseparable. Most recently, Pope Francis has called on the Law and Justice Party to defend life in the face of large-scale protests against their new abortion law. This is my book out in December, The New Demagogues, Religion, Masculinity and the Populist Epoch. And in that I focus in particular on the UK and Brexit and the role of religion and masculinity, but also Trump and evangelicals. Where a textualist church factions have little access to the corridors of power, they've demonstrated a willingness to align with the populist actors. And I'd argue that this directly challenges the religion as hijacked thesis. Similarities between hardline textualist Catholics and Muslims are compelling. And I've developed the concept of Catholicists to describe this group. Catholic Church has also demonstrated a willingness to align with far-right populist parties when it serves their interests. But more broadly, the patterns evident within the Catholic Church were seen across the religious spectrum I examined, including the Church of England and the decentralised evangelical churches in the US. Okay, thanks for your time. I think I'm done.
Thank you so much, Josh. Those were some really interesting cases that you presented on, and congratulations on the book again.
Thanks, Enqi.
So the next up is me and Anna. I'm just gonna share my screen. Oh, fancy. All right, so Anna and I will be speaking about the representation of religion and spirituality in Australian educational curricula. For those of you that I have not met before, my name is Enqi. Nice meeting you. Now, so Anna and I will be presenting, but Kim and Ruth, who are also present, have similarly contributed to the slides here. So I just want to acknowledge them. Now, we're mainly reporting from the education stream of this particular project, this ARC Discovery Project on religious diversity in Australia, maintaining social cohesion and preventing violence, where the aim of the project is to identify strategies to maintain social cohesion and prevent violent responses to religious diversity. So there's a project website if you're keen to find out a little bit more. The project is a collaboration between UTAS, Monash, and Deakin that involves Ezzy, Gary Barma, who is here, Greg Barton, as well as Anna Halafoff. And we also have researchers from Canada and the UK, Laura Beeman and Robert Jackson. Geraldine Smith, who is doing a PhD out of this project, is also here and will be presenting right after this. And there's some of us who are working on this project. Myself, Ruth, and Kim are present today. So I really just want to talk you through, I guess, a very brief about what the project is about before we kind of like focus on the educational aspect, which is what we're talking about today. So there are 6 streams. The first is the demographics aspect, which is to map out religious diversity across Victoria and Tasmania, which is the 2 key sites for this particular project. There's also the legislation side of things where policies, federal and state government policies are reviewed in terms of, where aspects of religious diversity are present. So for instance, the analysis of Victoria's Racial and Religious Tolerance Act of 2001 and the Religious Freedom Bill. There's also policing as a stream where interviews are being conducted with police as well as community leaders. And the migration stream, which I'm a little bit more familiar with, where we interviewed across 5 ethnic communities, the Chinese, Indian, Russian, the Afghan, and the African. So across community leaders, sometimes also religious leaders, as well as stakeholders. For the education aspect, it's focusing really on curriculum analysis, both national and state, but also some interviews are being conducted with community leaders and stakeholders. And then there's the interfaith aspect, which is ethnography of events. I think it's interfaith events, and I think Jerry can speak more a bit about this later. Over to Anna.
Thanks, Enqi. So the current ARC DP that we're on, as Enqi has explained, is also building on findings of our previous ARC on the worldviews of Australia's Generation Z. So I'm just quickly going to show a couple of slides here in terms of the religious and spiritual composition of young Australians, because that very much informs the analysis that we're doing of the media that Enqi will speak about next, and then also particularly when we're looking at education and curriculum. So as you can see on this slide, and many of you would have heard me present on this data in detail previously, it's a big project conducted with Mary Lou Rasmussen, Andrew Singleton, Gary, and myself. So here you can see that 52% of young Australians identify as non-religious, and that's much more than is reported in the census. And we think that's probably because young people were actually here allowed to answer the question themselves rather than have their parents answer it for them. And then you can see the breakdown there of other Christian religions, but then also substantive minorities, as we know, and that kind of roughly matches the census data, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu young Australians. Thanks, Enqi. Well, only one of us can control the slide, so Enqi's kindly doing that. Andrew Singleton is our quantitative guru, and he conducted, but also with our assistance, this latent class analysis where we actually took questions from the survey. It was a nationally representative survey, I should say, with 1,200 young Australians. So that data really does, the data really represents the whole Australian Gen Z cohort. But we found these 6 worldview types. And what's very important here for those of you who are not so familiar with sociology of religion and youth in Australia is that previous studies have really spoken about young people as being really sort of like indifferent and whatever, not really caring about religion. And that's certainly not what we found at all. We actually found that only 15% are genuinely indifferent or, not interested in religion at all. 23% are what we call this worldly, also sometimes referred to as sciencey, and they're basically the kind of hard religious nuns, the ones who really do not believe in any kind of religion or spirituality. Then you have 18% who are spiritual but not religious, and 8% who we've called seekers, but they are actually religious and spiritual. So if you put the two of them together, that's, a pretty large amount, 26% who identify as spiritual. And then we also have 17% who are religiously committed, who are mainly Christians and Muslims. And then 20% who are nominally religious, religious in the sense maybe like sort of more culturally religious or part of as part of their family tradition often. So Christians, Buddhists, and Hindus fall largely in that category. So again, the most important thing to think about here is imagine a classroom, right? This is what your classroom's going to look like. it will be very diverse. And within that classroom, you're going to have, yes, quite a lot of young people who are not religious, but not 52%, because you also have those ones in the middle who are indifferent and also who are spiritual. And then on the other side, you're still going to have a lot of religious young people there. So when you're mentioning religion and learning about religion, I think this is very, very important, and it's certainly not really kind of reflected in a lot of the literature and the research we've done previously on religion in schools, but it comes up quite interestingly now in a different sort of way in our current curriculum analysis. So back to Enqi.
Thanks, Anna. So I want to share on this media project that Anna and I worked on, because a similar approach was taken in the curriculum analysis. So I think it's helpful to see what's happening and going on in the media, and then to look at what is going on in Australian curriculum. So it's a multi-city project called A Religion on an Ordinary Day, where we focused on one particular day across 3 different years, and we did an analysis of these newspapers, the Australian Herald Sun, The Age, and MX. So we focused on pretty much Melbourne for this analysis. So essentially, we were looking at how religion and spirituality are depicted in mainstream media, and so we were making observations about religious diversity as presented in the media. We applied content analysis, and a code book was used that was formulated by Kim Knott, where religion and spirituality are broadly categorized as into these categories of conventional religion, common religion, and the secular sacred. Now, the code book sort of broadly captures various broad understandings as well as debates about concepts of religion and spirituality. And I think because I used it for my doctoral thesis as well, I find it particularly useful when tracking religious changes. So I'll talk you through a little bit about what these categories are about. Conventional religion, the name probably says what it is, focuses quite a bit on institutional organized religion, popular understandings of religion, whereas common religion captures that continuous presence of enchantment in society through references to the supernatural, or a sort of a reliance on an otherworldly kind of power to control the uncontrollable aspects of life, for instance, like, luck, chance. And then there's this category of the secular sacred, which is quite an interesting one, because it sort of covers that special, non-negotiable quality that are attached or ascribed to people, objects, systems, or any, like secular things. But it also captures systems of beliefs such as secularism, atheism, and humanism, as well as the sacred and religion-like expressions. So very broadly, the findings, so that you can sort of compare with what we have in the curricular analysis. And that is that, broadly speaking, religion, spirituality, and the secular sacred came up in a mixed range of ways in mainstream newspaper in Melbourne. There was quite a bit of an emphasis on Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, primarily, I think, because it was the Royal Commission that came up. So on sexual abuse, terrorism as well, related to Islam, and violence, and mostly negative. And what else? So Catholic, Anglican, and Judaism were also featured within these news stories on the Royal Commission. And a particular note on Islam coverage, primarily through international news events, but focusing on conflict in Syria as well as the rise of the Islamic State. I must say that similar with other sort of research in this area, News Corp has sensationalized a lot of these coverage on Islam, and tend to be a lot more negative as well. Now, comparatively, when Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism comes up in newspapers, they're mainly positive, but also exoticized, such as through like travel advertisements, for instance, or images of, you know, like Zen. That's the that comes up within these coverage. So we can say that, you know, the Abrahamic faith still has quite a significant place, given that, taking the H as an example, for instance, that there's a faith section that features Christianity as well as Islam. Whereas in common religion, it tends to cover, well, we found it across various genres, entertainment, sports, and we argue that, you know, there is that sustained enchantment in Australian public life. In entertainment, a lot of references to fairies, witches, vampires, ghosts. In sports, there is a lot of reliance, especially in footy, on, you know, luck, chance, betting. And for the secular sacred, we found a lot of references to religion like as well as the sacred. And they generally tend to be more positive as well, which, especially if we were to look at the through the lens of like sacred and religion like, it kind of signals to us, you know, a shift of media perceptions of public attitudes towards the sacred, where secular forms of the sacred are perhaps more socially acceptable or preferred over religious forms of sacred. And interestingly enough for us, which is why we kind of term it hidden religion, I suppose, is that these sacred and religion-like references often employ the use of Christian references. So for instance, like Obama as a political messiah, and which I guess that suggests to us that not only, which suggests to us the sort of multifaceted presence of Christianity in Australian public and political life, not just, you know, that overt negative aspect of it, but also in much more sort of hidden way. All right, that's me. Anna, over to you.
Okay, so I'm just going to move very quickly through this because we're pretty much out of time. So what we're doing is we've taken those code books and we've adapted them for the current project, and Emily Marriott is here as well. She's doing an analysis actually of media sources, the representation of different religious groups, and particularly sort of focused on COVID-19, and that's another publication we'll work on next year. But looking at the curriculum, Enqi, if you can just press the thing, because there's a bit of text there. So this table is actually looking at the word religion and where it appears in the Vic and the Oz curriculum. Now, the Oz curriculum has a lot more references, and you can't really do a straight sort of comparison there because the Oz curriculum has a section on elaborations that the Vic curriculum doesn't have. But if you just kind of look more sort of like percentage-wise in terms of the representation of where religion turns up, you can see it turns up in both, primarily in the languages and also in the humanities. And then something a little bit different is in civics and citizenship. The Australian curriculum has more emphasis there on religion than the Victorian one. I think we need to keep pressing. There might be a bit more text. So that sort of demonstrates this, you know, what other scholars have talked about is this securitization of religion, the fact that religion, you know, primarily turns up in those citizenship discourses. I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, please. So again, which religions turn up and where? Obviously, you can see a predominance of Christianity, and we titled our presentation on Christian privilege because Kathy Byrne in particular has written about that previously, and so has Marion Maddox, and we definitely have found some privileging in some of Christianity. Islam again comes up, many examples of Islam, and in the Australian curriculum also of Judaism. So again, you can see this kind of bias towards the Abrahamic faiths, which doesn't really necessarily reflect the actual religious composition of Australia, where once again Buddhism and Buddhism, Hinduism and Sikhism kind of get less attention. And again, you can see this disparity here, or that it's in the Oz curriculum, all of these religions get mentioned in civics and citizenship, and particularly Christianity, whereas in the Vic curriculum, it's much more in history and languages. Yes, next. And again, I think it might take a few clicks. Sorry, I did these slides. All right, so some of those things I've just already spoken about. In terms of spirituality, what's really interesting is spirituality is featured really quite prominently across the curriculum, and you can have a look here where it turns up. And it's very similar, I think, to the media analysis, is that spirituality is everywhere. Like it's all over it. I actually was really quite surprised by that myself. And again, the secular, much less attention on the secular, and particularly in civics and citizenship, and actually across both curricula. And the final slide, I think, oh no, we've got a couple more. So we have also dug down and done a quantitative analysis as well as qualitative as well as quantitative. What's very interesting here is that when you look at the difference between the Victorian and the Australian curriculum, in the Australian curriculum, it mentions that how Australia is a secular nation and a multi-faith society with a Christian heritage. Now, that with a Christian heritage part was introduced after the review during the time of the Abbott government, a review of the curriculum, and it does not appear there in the Vic curriculum at all. Next slide, please. And again, it's in the Australian curriculum because they have much more of an emphasis here on religion, and that explains why the references in the quant tables turn up so much more in civics and citizenship than in history in the Vic curriculum, which does not have those green sections in it. It also differently sort of says what it means to be Australian, and also stresses Australia's multicultural society. And then I think it's just the final slide now. Yeah, and if you just want to put all the text up, Enqi, thanks, and I'll just quickly talk through it. So again, what's interesting is that actually the study of religious diversity in Australia turns up mostly in civics and citizenship, actually in both curricula. Even though the Victorian one doesn't say a Christian heritage, it does talk about a multi-faith society. And again, as I said before, this really reflects this securitization of religion, with where you're talking about religion, but together with the obligations of citizenship, shared values and social cohesion, with reference to the Constitution, rights and the justice system. Both stress a secular nation, both stress a multi-faith society, but only the Oz stresses Christian heritage. Indigenous spirituality and religion is not mentioned in terms of the religious, the sort of religious demographics of Australia, and clearly that's problematic. It is mentioned though, and highlighted very strongly in terms of national identity. Both stress different perspectives and belonging, but the Australian curriculum has this what it means to be Australian, which is kind of like, I think, questioning belonging, which is something we can unpack further. Okay, thank you. Sorry to go over time.
Right, over to Jerry.
Thanks, Enqi. Okay, so as Enqi mentioned, I'm on the ARC project for religious diversity. I'm doing the branch on multi-faith. So today I want to just talk about something that I found in the past 18 months when I've been doing my ethnography of attending interfaith events and interviewing people that are leaders in interfaith organisations around in Sydney, Melbourne and Hobart. And specifically, what I found is that when I attended these events, most of these events, I really did stand out. Like, I'm 25 years old, and there really wasn't that many people even close to my age bracket. There's not a lot of millennials, there's not a lot of Gen Z. And this is a bit of a problem for people in interfaith because they need people to succeed them. They've worked long and hard to establish really durable interfaith networks between religious communities, and they need people to continue on that work. And you know, we need people working in this area. So I kind of want to talk about today is that problem. Why is that a problem? Why is this going on? And also thinking about, you know, what does it mean for how young people are engaging with religion for the future of interfaith? You know, if they do succeed the interfaith movement, what's it going to look like in 20 years? So I'll just talk about a few observations from people that I interviewed, and then I want to bring in the AGZ study just to frame what young people are doing. And then I want to talk about the predominance of the idea that interfaith is all about dialogue. And I want to show how this can be very problematic when you're trying to include young people. And then I want to just draw attention to a couple of multi-faith organisations that are or have been run by young people, and why they were successful and what they did that allowed them to include young people in a meaningful way. So the interfaith movement is very interested in young people. They do engage with young people through education and try and lobby for GRE in schools, but there's not a lot coming back. So there's not a lot of young people in leadership positions or organising things. So some of the things that I got in my interviews is that in times where the peak bodies or organisations have tried to bring in a young person's voice, is that they don't really get listened to, or the young person goes away thinking that they were just a bit tokenistic. It was kind of a superficial, okay, we can tick that box, we've had the young person come in, and they feel really disenfranchised and don't want to come back. Another problem that they highlighted to me is that a lot of young people just aren't really in mainstream religions, and interfaith is largely dominated by mainstream institutions. So they're just not there. They're just not present in the institutions, so they're not present in interfaith. And they just, as we'll talk about in a minute, is, they have different ways of engaging with religion. They don't just belong to one group and say that's it. They've got a whole range of different things going on. The other thing is, for a lot of young people, they don't really know how to mix as people of faith, as one person said, is that they don't do it very often. It isn't really something part of that generation. And this, I want to draw attention to this last quote, is that the baby boomers, they don't get it. Apparently interfaith dialogue was a thing of their time. We come to our time and it's not. So there's a kind of feeling that religion and religious identity isn't as important to millennials and Generation Z. I'm not really sure if that's really the case, but that was something that came out in the interviews, that our concerns have changed, or we have different concerns now.
Jerry, I don't think we can see your slides if you have slides.
Oh, sorry.
Don't worry. It was still fascinating. Don't worry about it.
Oops. Can you see them now?
Yes,
yes, we can.
All right. Well, I'll show you a few of the slides. Don't they look nice? Okay, anyway. So just going back to here, so just to recap on the AGZ study. So some of the things that came out of that is that, Generation Z and millennials, they have hybrid religious identities. They don't just belong to a single group. They're getting their spiritual worldviews from a whole range of sources. They're not just getting it from the religious leader telling them what to believe. They have access to the online world. They are gathering all of these different sources together. They've grown up in a time where religious institutions are under a lot of critique, with things like the same-sex marriage debate and the child sexual abuse in religious institutions, and now with the Religious Freedom Bill. And one thing that struck me in these studies is that there is a real conflict where young people are seeing that religion is valuable, but they don't want to get fully involved because they feel uncomfortable with how a lot of these traditional religions, their attitudes towards gender and sexuality, diversity and LGBTQI rights. So it's kind of like a bit of hesitancy in getting involved. So why does this make young people find it difficult to participate in multi-faith? And I think the reason has a lot to do with how interfaith is framed as dialogue. So even activities that are around forming friendships, or working together on social issues, or sharing around religious experiences, they're all described as dialogue, which I'd argue like a lot of those activities aren't dialogue. And so what is dialogue? Dialogue is kind of described as, this religious tradition takes their nugget of truth and they meet up with a delegate from another religious tradition who has their nugget of truth, and together through our discussions on theological and philosophical revelation revealed through our texts, we come to a better understanding of truth, or, you know, we come to realize what's common and what's different about our religious traditions, which is all great and fine, but it's a kind of engaging interfaith that can only really be done by a certain group, and that's the religious leaders who have been imbued with the legitimacy of the institution to go and be a representative of their tradition and talk to another representative of another tradition. That's fine. So religious leaders, and it's for educated elite, but it doesn't really allow any room for young people, or in some other cases, women or LGBT people. Like it doesn't really include those who sit at the margins of religious institutions and haven't been imbued with this kind of essential, unadulterated understanding of their tradition. So this makes things a little bit difficult for young people to get involved. And not all people posit interfaith in this way, but it is something that really sits at the bottom of a lot of literature and a lot of the things that I found in the interviews that I did. So just to draw your attention to a couple of exceptions to this. So in my research, I was able to interview the co-founder of Interaction and a current organizer for Youth Power. So Youth Power is an initiative of the Columban Centre in Sydney, and it's a youth initiative which recently has been working on putting together something they're calling a Sydney Statement, which is a kind of interfaith charter of, you know, what we as the people of Sydney want for our religiously diverse future. And the way that they've put together this statement is by a series of forums which I attended, where anyone was invited to come along and say, you know, this is what I think we should be talking about. This is the things that we should be including in this statement. So it was a very collaborative, a very fun kind of event to go to. So Interaction, so they actually lying dormant now, but we're very involved with doing things like having retreats where they brought young people together to become, you know, make friendships, and they did things like they borrowed Father Bob's food van to take food to public housing. So they did a lot of action-based work, and very much, you know, their tagline was common action for the common good. So very much an activist kind of role. And so these two organizations, what makes them different and why they've been successful in young people is for a few reasons. One is they put young people in leadership. So rather than it being a peak body or a big organization bringing in this one young person to be our kind of token young person's voice, this is something that's organized and led by young people. They're there to set the agenda and to decide what they are concerned with. So there's this really great quote that I got from Nivi, who was the co-founder of Interaction, where she kind of sums it up really well. It's not meant to sound harsh, but we had seen interfaith done by older people, what I call tea and biscuit interfaith, where people sit around a table and talk, which is fine. But we had that sense of urgency that comes with being a young person. Like, there's so much need in the community. And I think that really highlights how we could bring young people into faith is by focusing on this aspect of social action. Let's go and do something, or on aspects of let's form friendships, let's share, let's learn about each other and sharing our experiences, rather than it being a kind of, okay, you're going to represent your religious tradition and I'm going to represent mine, and we can have a dialogue over that. So I think that's what these groups did really well. And I also want to kind of suggest that just going back to what was highlighted in the studies on young people is it this conflict over religion and gender and sexual diversity. And I think that this is an area which a lot of multi-faith organisations won't touch, and they don't want to deal with it because it's too contentious. But I think for a lot of young people, this is something that can't be ignored. It's the elephant in the room. It's something that needs to be talked about and reconciled. So I think that a youth-led organisation kind of has the space to reconcile all of the diversities that they live in now, because it's not just about religious diversity, it's about everything that's going on in their lives. And I think it's important that that's where the focus is, and just allowing them to reconcile all these different things. And so kind of concluding thoughts is, if the interfaith movement does succeed in bringing young people in, bringing in the next generations, and who are these hybrid, multiple belongings, kind of non-mainstream people, what is that going to look like? I can't really predict it, but I think it's going to change with the next generation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jerry. That's really fascinating. Okay. Oh. All right. How are we going with time? I think we have about 20 minutes for questions from the floor. We don't have a lot of people in the room, so